Mobile-enabled transformation initiatives such as Office 365 and BYOD are exposing organizations to new threats, including mobile phishing, malware, and exploits like Pegasus. According to Zimperium's 2022 Global Mobile Threat Report, 84% of organizations have enabled Microsoft Office 365 on mobile devices, and 51% of survey respondents say they have installed 4 to 8 work-specific apps on their mobile devices. So what is the current mobile threat landscape telling us about the future of mobile device management? How can organizations effectively enable productivity tools on mobile devices without compromising security? And how can organizations gain more telemetry in order to detect which attacks will do the most damage? Well, in this webinar, we'll discuss what the new infrastructure stack looks like, how MDT, MDM, MAN, and EPP technologies should work together, and the best path forward for continuing to enable employee productivity while providing robust security with 2 of the industry's leading experts, Gartner research analyst Chris Silva and Zimperium Chief Technology Officer John Patterson. And we'll start first by welcoming in Chris Silva from Gartner.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to talk today about how to evolve mobile security for an O365 and SaaS application world. At Gartner, we spend a lot of time both looking at trends of how technology usage patterns evolve over time and how usage patterns track to what's possible with technology. So I like to think a lot about this first image here on the left. We've done a great job within IT of building gates, making sure that we're protecting the assets that matter most, making sure that we're properly vetting users before we give them access to some of that critical information. But the problem that arises is, in many cases, when I talk to Gartner clients, I'm finding that we're still in the business of building gates and not at this point evolving to a place where we're using rich contextual information to authenticate our users, to ensure that we can monitor their activities and sessions and ensure that we're continually authenticating them and monitoring their sessions for activities and behaviors and other issues that might warn us of a potential insider threat or the reuse of credentials from an outside entity looking to make its way into our systems. We really should be at a place today where we're no longer building gates and fences, but we're building better authentication mechanisms and using the richness of data that's there in our systems to understand who a user is, what they're trying to do, and effectively give them the access that is the least frictionful experience for them while maintaining or even improving our IT security. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of these new use cases are and what some of the new needs are that have challenged the traditional zone of control and the traditional tool set and approach that IT has embraced for the last decade around mobile devices and connecting users to critical data. The presumption of control has been challenged. And these are all questions that Gartner clients have asked us. And I think in the answers, you'll understand a little bit more about why so much of the focus today is on a change in the nature of our approach to control and security for mobile devices and mobile data. One of the first questions here, and one that comes up all the time, is one of almost confusion. I hear from clients saying, listen, we've moved our applications to SaaS, but I'm still controlling the device. I'm still using VPN. Is this the right way to go about it, or am I actually getting in the way of my users? And from Gartner's point of view, new experiences, new SaaS applications, the ability for somebody to pick up whatever device they'd like, access information with a login and maybe an app download, this experience requires new control points because otherwise we're degrading the user experience. We're applying old models like forcing traffic for a SaaS app over VPN or locking down a device configuration when in fact most of what the user is accessing and interacting with is in the cloud. We need to rethink how we handle endpoint devices, specifically mobile devices, in order to continue providing users with a positive experience and continuing to improve upon that experience day in and day out. Privacy is another issue that has come to light. In many places, it's driven by changes in the legal environment, but more often than not, it's been driven by the fact that users know enough about tools like device management to be dangerous. And I hear all the time from clients saying, is there a better way to do this? My users are pushing back. They don't like the idea that I have full control over their device. And by the way, a lot of times those conversations are happening where IT simply doesn't have that zone of control or that scope of control. Nevertheless, users push back. And the idea of presuming access on a managed, configured, or locked down device, it's a really, really hard sell these days. And in some cases, as we'll discover later, may not actually address some of the key security concerns that IT teams have today. Lastly, there are going to be places where my traditional control points and tools simply don't work. Tools like mobile device management or unified endpoint management simply have no place on certain devices, whether I'm dealing with temporary employees or contractors, or I'm trying to provide access to users who simply need access to one tool, one SaaS application, or one set of productivity apps, where taking on control of the hardware and configuration is onerous for the user. It's onerous for IT to take those operational steps to ensure the device is configured in a certain way, and still not really solving some of the key access-based and identity-based security concerns that are driving security investment today. So the first step in evaluating what models make sense for which use cases is to use those use cases to figure out what control changes are needed. So we're all familiar with the on-network, on-prem days of full device control, where tools like unified endpoint management and MDM profiles were there to augment the technology we already had. We were looking to wrap better protections and authentication around relatively weak protocols, things like ActiveSync. And it was a necessary step to raise the posture and profile of the device and provide better security. But as operating systems have matured and as the unified endpoint management tools themselves have matured, we have more options. As you look at the hybrid SaaS model, which is where a lot of organizations fit today, there can be migration to SaaS applications. Office 365 and Google Workspace being some of the first places where we see organizations make these investments and start pushing users to new frontiers, new tools, and new ways of accessing information. We can now, across iOS and Android devices, offer partial device control, where we manage our applications and some of the device settings so that we can ensure that VPN profiles are there if needed, or we can push out a Wi-Fi profile for users returning to the office after 2 years who honestly don't remember how to get on the Wi-Fi. It's a good balance of control between IT and the user. But organizations are still trying to push further and further away from control, and many of them are focused on this model on the far right, especially when what's being accessed is a set of pure SaaS applications. So we've seen a lot of interest in unenrolled or unmanaged devices with an application on them that itself is secured. Much of the interest around this is being driven by use cases like bring your own device or personal devices, where IT does not want that tight or broad scope of control on the device due to concerns about privacy, due to concerns about employment law. It's increasingly popular to see an application management only or MAM only approach, where the application is provided on the device with some self-protections on it, but the true span of control is around authentication, identity, multi-factor access, and authentication tools to ensure that we're putting the user through a reasonable gauntlet before giving their device and its application access to the data. This is a really tight span of control for IT, where only its app or set of applications is affected. If I'm pushing the Office 365 suite of productivity tools to users, I can manage those tools, let them share data, but not have to take a step of managing or configuring the user's device as a whole. This is something that has driven a whole lot of interest in even switching UEM tools, with interest accruing to vendors like Microsoft that offer this control. And we've seen a lot of organizations take a wholesale shift in their UEM vendor approach to get this type of access, but it's incomplete. Key applications like Workday, applications like Salesforce, they haven't been built with the tooling inside the application to allow it to be managed on their own. And it leaves organizations with one of two choices: manage the device in some way or another, which is usually going uphill with their users, and in many cases, the opposite direction that they want to move in terms of flexibility and control, or manage what they can, and leave some of those applications like Salesforce and Workday with critical and sensitive data in them unmanaged in hopes that the application can offer the ability to cache no data on the device and that its credentials are secure. In most cases, that finger-crossing exercise, hoping that what I can do is enough, simply won't meet the bar for internal security compliance and certainly not regulatory compliance. All three of these models have their shortcomings, and even in the more flexible ways that we can deploy unified endpoint management today, there are problems. Now, let's get into some of the specifics of those different models and the trade-offs with them. Well, first of all, the notion of an implied trust model is dead. This model simply no longer works. It used to be that if I knew the user and the device and I had everything in place like a device enrollment and certain device features like an OS level at a certain point, an application level at a certain point, the presence of a certificate, with all of those things in place, I could take a device, it would share its information to my UEM console, get its configuration, and I had access to my applications. Today, this binary access mechanism simply isn't robust enough. We know that applications and their configuration, or even the presence of certain applications on the device, can change over time, and that device posturing may not take into account some of those changes to the device. There's certainly no means to look at behavioral signatures of applications and user-based behaviors, though we can add some tooling to augment this. So number one, we think about this classic model, this implied trust model, as it stands with a management tool at the center of it. It is incomplete. What we start seeing is the addition of mobile-specific security tools like MTD or mobile threat defense there to make this model a bit more tenable. Now, I still know the user and I know the device, but I want something richer. I want better context to vet that user before I grant them access to the applications and data, whether they're sitting in my data center or sitting in a SaaS application. And mobile threat defense offers a little bit more context, a little bit more richness to understand not just who's the user, what's the device, but where is the user? What are they doing? What are the different activities that are happening on that device? Is there an application that's acting in a way that might indicate some compromise or some intent to compromise my data? We have a richer, more dynamic authentication process. And for devices that are managed, this is an additional and necessary step from Gartner's point of view to ensure that there's a bidirectional flow of security information from the device. Now, I talked a little bit before about unmanaged devices, which seems a bit heretical as a term or as a way to think about securing our data, but this is the reality that many organizations face today. As they move to Google Workspace or Office 365 and realize that their instructions to users can be as simple as download that application, log into it, and there is no step 3, there's a huge amount of security telemetry and visibility that we're giving up. When we have no device context or control, which is increasingly a realistic position for IT and IT security people to find themselves in, we need to constantly validate the user, their context, and adjust policies so that access is determined based on real-time information. What's interesting about a tool like mobile threat defense, in contrast to the previous use case where it is there to augment unified endpoint management, in cases where unified endpoint management doesn't apply or can't be applied, or we're dealing with applications that simply aren't architected to work in that rigid construct, a standalone mobile threat defense tool can act as a way to fill in some of the gaps around bringing richer security information to IT, but also as a means to provide some user-facing benefits like single sign-in across applications and the support for multi-factor authentication that traditionally MDM and UEM tools have fulfilled. So here we have a use case and an opportunity to better protect devices and users and the apps and data on them that have this lighter touch management, have better telemetry to make more informed access decisions, and have the ability to provide richer security for devices that are, to that point of use, unseen and unknown. It's more flexibility for users, and it's greater visibility and flexibility for IT. The continual feedback loop from a mobile threat defense tool allows us over time to continually refining our policies and the posture that we feel is necessary and supportable for access to our apps and data. I want to dig in a little bit more into why management alone cannot really serve this purpose and cannot really fill all these use cases. So again, our thought around dealing with mobile device security and mobile data security starts and in some cases ends with a management-focused view of the world. We know that we can push policies and configuration and device and application patches with UEM. Clearly, that must be our route to get endpoint security for these mobile devices. It's a well-tested, well-understood approach, but it's incomplete. Like we talked about, we're seeing a dialing back of control on devices, either driven by users, by concerns around privacy, or both. SaaS applications that can access data from any device, from any location, when we put tight controls around those or force that traffic on specific paths like VPN, we're causing bottlenecks for users. And basically what ends up happening is mobile becomes a second-class platform from a security standpoint. It's both harder for users to take advantage of and use without friction, and it may be less secure because the information around access, the information around posture and user behavior is a binary snapshot, single snapshot in time. To get in a little bit more to these management models that are possible, especially for organizations that are still looking at everything as sort of a gate-based approach on the far left, where a managed device is the only way to get access to data, there are more flexible models that have emerged. We talked a little bit about the MAM-WE, or Mobile App Management Without Enrollment model on the far right, where I'm managing applications on their own, and in some cases, managing a single identity or portion of an application. This is at the heart of what many organizations have looked to Microsoft Intune and Microsoft Endpoint Manager to provide. It's viewed in many contexts as a more flexible, more appropriate approach for use cases like bring your own device and other personal devices. But at that far right construct, in stark contrast to the tight control and rich visibility on the left, we simply don't have the way to gather enough data to know that that device and that user are who they say they are and that they're safe. We can split the difference and go with a limited MDM approach where some device settings are controlled and some applications are controlled while others are unavailable to have data shared to them and are not visible to IT. Here too, partial device control means a smaller set of options and a much less rich set of telemetry and data that IT has to work with in order to make decisions around access on the fly and autonomously. Limited management will leave us lacking the ability to take on full device configuration. For an example, I can insist that a device in a limited MDM profile has something like a PIN code attached to it. Naturally, I want to ensure a PIN code for the device is there because that's my flag to know that device data is encrypted. But what I cannot do is actually enforce a PIN complexity requirement or change the PIN or lock that device. So my control is limited and my ability to take true and exhaustive remediation steps like locking or wiping that device, those options are no longer on the table. The other issue here is when we deal with users who, for one reason or another, privacy, employment, construct, or ownership of the device, simply can't entertain an MDM or UEM enrollment, this management model still does require that MDM slot on the device being occupied. And if another entity has already taken that space and placed management on that device, my only option is to look to MDM-less management, where I have control over an app. I have the ability to put controls like a PIN code or other MFA in front of the application itself, but I am fundamentally unable to see the other apps on that device, look at their behavior, and even understand the true posture and configuration of that device in such a way that I can take action to remediate issues that might be a security concern. The point here, when we focus on and start with a management tool as our approach to securing devices, even with the flexibility that's been added to these tools and to the mobile OSs that they manage, we're still leaving gaps, and we cannot support things like a true zero trust approach. We cannot take steps to take into account rich telemetry around the user, whether it's biometric data, data on use patterns, or data on the applications that populate that device to know and take action when an application takes a step to compromise data, to compromise the device, or take other actions that we feel are risky for our users and our data and want to step in and thwart those actions as they're happening. There's a whole long list of capabilities, controls, and areas of key compliance concern that the mobile threat defense tools offer that build on what UEM delivers for IT. We often get the question around endpoint management tools as whether or not they're security controls or whether or not they're security tools. And from Gartner's point of view, they play a key role in the overall security architecture. But at the end of the day, UEM tools are there to automate and orchestrate and allow for a smoother operational flow of enrolling and disenrolling devices and getting users access to information. But even that flexibility and orchestration that they can provide only extends to a point and so far on that device and does not take into account many of the needed controls and the visibility necessary to deal with today's adversaries who are focused on users and focused on user credentials as a way to gain access to an organization's network and devices and then move laterally to create more and lasting damage inside that environment. We are blind to these types of potential attacks when we only look at that top bar in the management stack for mobile. So how do you build better? What does it look like? Well, let's talk a little bit about it. So we've talked about unified endpoint management, mobile device management, mobile threat defense. And the question that we hear often from our clients is, which one do I need? And the answer to that is somewhat smugly, yes. There are going to be places where we need operational control of our devices. But just like we don't look at our endpoint management tools for PCs as the source for endpoint protection, EPP, or endpoint detection, EDR technology, for some reason we have this penchant to do so with mobile. UEM is an orchestration and automation tool, and it is not a security tool. It can't offer proactive protections against the current threat environment. We see a whole lot more investment to make security more proactive, especially at the edge. But what's been interesting to see is that so much of this investment is focused on the PC, the Windows devices, the Mac devices. Tons of investment and a huge uptick in investment over the past couple of years in endpoint protection and endpoint detection tools. But we tend to see those tools rolled out and deployed only to the Windows and Mac environment, with mobile, if being considered at all, being considered as a much later second step. The protections from these tools like EPP and EDR on PC make a lot of sense. They're there to look at user and application behaviors, device configuration. They're acting as an active sentinel on the device to step in when needed because of behaviors or actions that look like they might represent a threat. That is the role that mobile threat defense plays for our mobile devices on iOS and on Android. It's active remediation and telemetry gathering. Though, as we'll talk about in a moment, the offerings for mobile from some of the traditional security vendors, the EPP vendors, when contrast with mobile threat defense vendors and offerings as defined by Gartner, there's a very big difference in terms of what these tools can provide. The net for organizations using a unified endpoint management tool today is that UEM and mobile threat defense in concert bring mobile to parity with PCs from a protection standpoint and offer us the protections and the telemetry necessary to deal with the advanced adversaries that are out there today looking to steal credentials to get into organizations and do greater and more lasting damage. By the way, it's also important to note that where UEM is not an option, mobile threat defense can stand in on its own as a means to provide zero trust access, federate single sign-on across applications, and continue generating telemetry to help us make better, smarter, faster access decisions through the continual feedback loop that it offers. So where UEM isn't in place or doesn't have a role for a given user, mobile threat defense on its own plays as important, if not a more important role, by providing active protections and better visibility around devices and applications where it either cannot exist because UEM does not apply or can't be applied, or is not in place because UEM alone simply won't provide that richness. So I want to wrap up with some recommendations, but before I do, I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the types of endpoint protection that we see in market today and how they differ. So when we think about mobile devices, there are two camps from which this technology comes. The first is mobile threat defense. It's a dedicated market of tools and vendors building out active security controls to be deployed on their own or in tandem with UEM on mobile devices. From Gartner's point of view, when making endpoint security investments, mobile threat defense today should be considered as its own area of investment and tools selected there on their merits to serve the existing environment across platforms, applications, and the compliance and security needs of the organization. What's most important is that mobile threat defense tools offer telemetry, they offer active monitoring, but they also offer on-device remediation, the ability to step in and take action when something goes out of compliance or acts in a way that indicates a threat or compromise. In contrast, the mobile offerings from endpoint protection vendors or EPP and EDR vendors, the CrowdStrikes of the world, the SentinelOnes and Palo Alto Cortex XDRs of the world, they tend to solve this problem a bit differently. Someone like a CrowdStrike Falcon Mobile agent can sit on the device and gather telemetry toward a goal of providing a much richer set of telemetry and security event data to make correlations and make decisions around access, around device posture, the need for quarantine, and so forth. But they don't provide, in most cases, that active remediation on the device or the ability to step in and take action either in conjunction with a UEM or if a UEM or MDM isn't in place on the device itself. Vendors in this space like Palo Alto, who have a large network presence, oftentimes will look at the mobile endpoint as a way to use network telemetry to triangulate issues. They address mobile, they can offer protections for mobile, but they're doing it using telemetry around the device, not necessarily on the device. It's most important to note that in the EPP and EDR markets, the offerings for mobile will range from basic mobile EPP or EDR, the telemetry gathering tools that are simply there to extend our view, and those who offer a OEM or licensed mobile threat defense tool that offers more rich capability. For this reason, we insist that clients look at mobile threat defense as its own discipline with its own set of requirements and conduct bake-offs and POCs with those tools independent of the UEM or the EPP and EDR tool. Gartner expects over time that the EPP and EDR vendors will continue to invest in this market and bring more proactive protections to the fore. But it's very important today to remind yourselves as you look at these tools and vendors that when it comes to mobile threat defense, specifically from traditional endpoint security vendors, it's imperative to understand the nature of the offering, whether it's their own technology or licensed, and whether it can meet the definition of a full mobile threat defense tool, because in some cases they won't. So we've talked about mobile threat defense and how it can be used on its own with UEM, why it is different and in some cases more valuable for security purposes than traditional orchestration and automation tools. But how do you take this and put it into practice? Well, number one, if it's not already done, conduct a gap analysis and understand how your PC environment, your Macs and your Windows environment, your server environment, how are those devices and entities protected and agented? And is there a gap between those devices and mobile? As I say, in most cases, when we talk to clients, we find that there's a pretty big chasm between what's being done on the PCs, where there's a whole bunch of proactive, rich security tooling and telemetry being generated, versus mobile that can in some cases be unagented entirely or lacking the ability to track rich and important security telemetry data. Number two, understand and accept there will be use cases where UEM simply doesn't fit, where managing a device or worse, controlling a device with onerous restrictions is not the right path to achieve a secure outcome for users. Onerous controls will drive users to seek ways around compliance. And in many cases, onerous controls with a one-size-fits-all application of policies to personal and corporate devices will have a huge chilling effect on the participation of users in BYOD, robbing the business of using those off-hour cycles and capturing those business moments that can only happen when a user's executing on the device that they carry with them every day. Stop using managed as a shorthand for secured devices. very much like in the PC world where we think about old metrics such as percent patched or percentage of devices that are meeting a certain compliance mark. This doesn't give us an active view of what's actually secured and where we can actually take steps to better secure data and provide richer context for our access decisions. Managed is not secured. Light touch management models, especially those like the MAM-WE or mobile app management without enrollment model, that's increasingly popular to give access with low friction to users with Office 365 apps and others, needs to be augmented with mobile threat defense to provide that richness of telemetry and that active zone of control on the devices that are handling sensitive data and other company data. And then understanding the differences between the mobile endpoint protection or EPP and EDR offerings versus MTD. If you're currently working and making investments on your Macs and Windows devices with an endpoint protection or endpoint detection vendor, understanding not just what their mobile offering is, but how it compares to a full mobile threat defense offering with active control on the device and the ability to stand as the main protection mechanism for devices enforcing zero trust may not be all within the capabilities of the endpoint security vendor's mobile agent. And knowing the difference and knowing how to spot the difference between a full mobile threat defense tool and a mobile EPP is a very important piece of understanding what tools to bring in and how they'll work together with other pieces of infrastructure in the endpoint ops and endpoint security domains. I really enjoyed having this time with you today to talk through some of these issues and some of the potential better solutions that we can use to get away from building gates and fences and get closer to a handprint scan user unique identification mechanism to secure our data, provide better access, and ensure that we're monitoring the signals that will be our earliest warning signs of potential attack. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. And now let's welcome in John Patterson from Zimperium.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Patterson. I am Zimperium's CTO. And today I will be talking to you about our solutions for some of the scenarios that Chris was describing earlier in the presentation around the hybrid and the pure SaaS application protections, especially when we're looking at unmanaged device configurations. But before I go into that, I first want to give you some background on our technology and how that's applied to solve this particular problem. At Zimperium, we have an engine that leverages both behavioral and machine learning models to solve modern endpoint problems. Specifically, we are looking to solve problems around device attacks. That can be attacks that target the operating system and the platform of the mobile device itself. Network-based attacks, mobile devices leverage Wi-Fi connections often, and those can be a significant threat. Phishing, a continued risk for mobility. And finally, apps, both apps from a malware perspective, but also from a risk and privacy. This engine is embedded into our technology and our product that we call Zips. Now we know about the engine that powers our solution. Let's talk about our product itself. At Zimperium, our solution is looking across the entire life cycle of risk and threat for mobile devices, starting with the initial risk identification, through to proactive threat detection, through to remediation actions and workflows, and ultimately reporting back to our console and further integrations. On the risk identification side of the house, we're looking at everything from vulnerabilities to configuration on that mobile device through to sideloaded applications and unsecured Wi-Fi and other network-based risks. We are also looking at the device proactively, monitoring for exploitation or high-level threats on that mobile device. For example, phishing sites or changes to the file system and modification of the security controls on that platform or malware on that device, and then proactive network threats such as rogue access points or man-in-the-middle attacks. When we've detected those threats, ultimately we will trigger a number of different remediation workflows Those remediation workflows can be instigated by ourselves through the Zip solution, such as disabling Wi-Fi, sinkholing network traffic, or even triggering app uninstallations. Also, through the blocking phishing sites. If we are connected to MDM environments, we can also trigger MDM compliance actions and workflows. We'll talk about some of the MAM-related workflows later in the presentation. And we will provide detailed forensics back to the Security Operations Center. That information is able to be shared with both SIM, EDR solution, XDR solutions, and other threat hunting tools. With that in mind, let's dig into the specific use cases that Chris was discussing earlier. I want to talk now about the scenario that Chris discussed earlier in the presentation, specifically a unmanaged device that is using managed apps only, a hybrid SaaS environment. In this solution set here, our solution, the Zimperium Zip solution, is installed on the device and is proactively monitoring that device for any risks and threats. Through our integration with the Microsoft service and suite, we are able to trigger remediation workflows proactively through that application. And the workflow really works like this. Initially, we will see the threat on that mobile device. Perhaps it's a side-loaded application, and we will trigger any of our immediate on-device remediations. That could be notifying the user to remove or remediate the risk, or triggering some automatic threat response in our solution itself. We will, at the same time, pass that threat information back to our Z console that allows the forensics to be collected and provide visibility and secondary responses to that particular threat. We will immediately be passing that threat and risk change for this mobile device to the Microsoft EMS services. When EMS receives this message, it will trigger any defined conditional access rules that are specific for this device or application. That policy will be pushed down immediately to the device, and then that conditional access policy will be enforced at the application level. An example of that enforcement can be something like not being able to open the application until the risk is remediated. Let's take a look at an example of that type of risk and threat in action. In this case, Microsoft Outlook will be protected not only at install time by Zips, but proactively by Zips when the application is running. Let's walk through the entire process. Starting with the installation, I go through the normal process, entering my credentials into the application, and that works through the normal log-on process. What is different, however, is that the conditional access policy states that Zips is a required application and highlights to the user to download the app from the App Store. Let's follow that step, install Zips. We download Zips. We go back to the Microsoft application. We click open, which links to the Zips application, and we are now authenticated and logged onto the device. We can now open Outlook again, click the recheck status button, and we can see that we are now able to get access to Outlook because the device is compliant, it has Zips installed, and that Zips is showing no threats on that application. Let's now trigger a threat and see a proactive response action. To trigger a threat, we are now going to sideload a profile onto the device. I've been to a website, I'm downloading the profile. I will enable the profile under the security configuration to allow this app to run on the device. Immediately, you will notice that Zips has noted a sideloaded app and has raised the risk posture of that mobile device, highlighting a high-risk sideloaded application. This will raise the security risk posture of this device to the Microsoft EMS service. We will try and access Outlook, but now we are unable to access Outlook because the threat level is high. Clicking open, we can see the risk in the device. So if I click on the open option here, I can see in the apps, there is a side-loaded app installation here. I will go and remove the application that is mentioned. So I'll delete the application from the mobile device. I will then confirm in Zips if the app threat has been removed. In this case, it has. That's excellent. I will now move back to Microsoft Outlook, where I will click Recheck Status to reassess my status. And now I can enter my PIN code and re-access Outlook again safely. Another scenario that we developed that has been very popular with our enterprise customers is leveraging a joint solution on an individual mobile device. In these scenarios, the customer is leveraging application controls through managed enterprise apps delivered by an MDM, but leveraging the best of MAM-enabled applications to trigger conditional access at the application level itself. Zimperium is uniquely positioned to be able to offer both of these services concurrently. So, for example, when a threat or risk is detected, we will trigger a compliance action at the MDM level, for example, removing the enterprise apps, and trigger an application-specific response, such as locking that application at the MAM app level concurrently on the same mobile device. This is an extremely powerful solution and also allows enterprises to leverage the flexibility that they need for all configurations. Chris talked about a further challenge that we face in the industry, leveraging zero trust and pure SaaS-based applications. In this case, the application does not have any SDK or tooling built into the application, but yet we want to be able to provide this application to unmanaged devices. How can we do this and ensure the risk posture of that mobile device? As we all understand, it is important to validate the user and the device before we give access to a particular user and device to any given service. In this solution, we are able to provide our risk posture to Ping Identity, who is then able to leverage that capability, that attestation of that mobile device to decide if that combination of that user and that specific device is able to access a given service at any moment in time. Let's see this solution in action. Let's take a look now at how the Zip solution can help with a fully enabled SaaS application that has no embedded SDK, no way to be able to understand the risk posture and provide device-based attestation. This is exactly the same scenario that we had before with the Microsoft example, where I have already installed or sideloaded a malicious app onto the device. Let's take a look at the other scenario that Chris described, the fully enabled SaaS application. In these cases, the applications do not have an SDK that allows any risk posture or device attestation to be passed directly to the application. However, Zimperium has worked closely on a solution with Ping Identity to be able to bring that capability to SaaS-enabled applications such as Salesforce. In this demonstration, we're going to look at Salesforce that has that workflow defined. And again, on this device, I have sideloaded an application onto the device to be able to raise the risk posture. Let's log into Salesforce and see how the workflow progresses. I log into my domain, passing my username and password credentials. And then we can see immediately during the logon process, I am being blocked from actually accessing the SaaS application. But notice here, the visibility of that threat and the issue is actually being provided directly inside the SaaS-enabled application. In this case, Salesforce highlighting that a sideloaded app is on the device and that we need to remediate that scenario. You can see at the same time, Zips is actually sending me a message to tell me that my logon has failed. So let us remediate that risk and then try the logon again. So I'm going to close the app down. I'm going to go to the Zips app, confirm the threat and the application I need to remove. I'm going to remove the application from the device. I can confirm that the threat has been removed. And now I'm going to click the recheck option, put in my credentials again. And this time I'm able to access Salesforce because my risk posture is low. The threat has been mitigated. I want to thank you for your time today. At Zimperium, we are very excited about our ability to provide threat and risk mitigation and device attestation from fully managed devices through to complete BYOD and SaaS-enabled services. We look forward to being able to help you with your security challenges around modern endpoints